Hello, everyone, and welcome to this final weekend of this series, Entanglement, Physics, Mind, and Worlds. I'm James Pete Barbieri, Program Coordinator here at the Parry Center, and I will be your host for today. As a host, I'm here to help you, so any problems, just let me know in the chat. Just very briefly, a quick reminder to please ensure that your microphone is muted, that the chat is open, so feel free to share your ideas throughout the talk. We do have closed captions available if that's how you prefer to view this session. And of course, this session is recorded for archival purposes, and you should receive the recording in just a few days. So today we are honored to be joined by Dean Radin. Dean is Chief Scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, Associate Distinguished Professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and Chairman of the biotech company Cognigenics. He earned an MS in Electrical Engineering and a PhD in Psychology from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And in 2022, he was awarded an honorary Doctor of Science from the Swami Vivekananda University, an accredited university in Bangalore, India. Radin also worked at AT&T Bell Labs, Princeton University, University of Edinburgh, and SRI International. He is an author and co-author of some 300 scientific and popular articles, 4 dozen book chapters, and 9 books, including The Conscious Universe, Entangled Minds, Supernormal, and Real Magic. Today, he will be talking to us in his presentation entitled Entangled Mind and Matter. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Dean. Welcome.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. So there it is. I will assume, unless I hear otherwise, that you can see it.
We can, yes.
Okay. So my part here is to fill in the mind aspect of our series. And I want to thank the people at the Parry Center for inviting me. This is quite an honor for me as well. So as Basil said the other day, this is the not so standard stuff about entanglement. And so I always begin my talks with, without further ado, here's the author of Mind Over Matter. Sometimes we are not able to see things directly in front of our face, but I hope you'll see that that's not the case here. So I'm going to do one slide on personal background because I've been involved in some unusual research for most of my career. And then a little bit about the history of mind-matter interaction research, a philosophical way of thinking about it. I'll state a testable hypothesis based on the philosophy, and then spend most of my time on experimental tests. And if we have time at the end, I'll talk a little bit about worldviews. I'll talk for about 50 minutes, and then we'll take a 10-minute break, and then either finish the slides if I didn't get through them all, or we'll just do Q&A at that point. So one thing that wasn't mentioned is that my career started as a violinist. I actually expected to become a concert violinist, and very early on went to music conservatories, this one at the Hart School. I was 14 and had a full scholarship there. And everyone, including myself, thought I was going to end up being a violinist as my career. But it also turned out I was interested in lots of other things. So I got the degrees that were mentioned. I've worked in a variety of different places in Silicon Valley, in the academic world, and in the industrial world. I've been at the Institute of Noetic Sciences now for 22 years, and at the California Institute of Integral Studies for 6 years. I've given, this will be my 707th talk. And so I've given talks to many of the universities around the world and lots of other venues. Also to yoga ashrams. So this is the Sivananda, Brahmakumaris, Swami Vivekananda, and many others, some in India, some elsewhere. One day, I actually gave a talk at the Naval War College in the morning and at the Brahmakumaris Peace Village in the afternoon, both of which are in Rhode Island. So I had my own version of War and Peace on the same day. I've also given talks to the Naval Postgraduate School, to the Special Operations Forces for the U.S. Army, for the Naval War College, for DARPA, for the National Academy of Sciences. You may be surprised that these kinds of places are interested in the kind of work that I do, but privately, basically everywhere is interested. You just don't hear about it often publicly. I've given talks to a number of industrial places, almost always to the senior management. Not always, sometimes they let their other employees watch as well. Also for the government in Australia, for the government in Malaysia, many television shows and documentaries and so on. I was also on what is now known as Project Stargate, which was the US government's classified program of using psychics for espionage. As mentioned, I'm a co-founder and chairman of Cognigenics, which is a neuroengineering company, which is using CRISPR, the genetic editing method, to develop a new class of psychiatric treatments. And I'm also consulting on a television show, which is under development now, maybe by Netflix, but maybe some other streaming service, we're not sure yet, which will have an underlying theme, which will be in the domain of what you're about to hear about. Oh, by the way, that's not a documentary series, it's a scripted series, a science fiction series. So these are the books that I've mentioned if you want to know more about the kind of work that I've done and also within the field at large. And if you want to see the actual publications, the journal publications, many of them, not all, but many are available on my website at that tab. So the question then is, does mind interact directly with matter? Well, you can find a lot of people doing tricks, and the tricks are often pretty impressive. This one happened to be in the street in Paris, and that's a famous levitation trick. But the history of this goes all the way back to the beginning of empiricism itself. So when Sir Francis Bacon wrote this book, Silva Silvarum, A Natural History in 10 Centuries, all throughout that book, he's saying, well, if you wanted to know if this was a real thing, here's how you would test it, beginning of empiricism. So one of the things that he mentions is the force of imagination. And what he meant by that is what today we would call something like intention. Does mental intention interact with the world at large? And the way he suggested to do that is to toss dice. So you assign one of the faces of the dice to appear, and you toss the dice, and it's a random decision. And if more often than not you get that face, it would suggest that, yeah, the force of imagination does something. So 300 years later, J.B. Rhine at Duke University actually started doing this. So they started initially with hand-tossed dice, and then you put the dice in a cup, and then you have a machine, and it became more and more sophisticated over time. But they were essentially following what Francis Bacon had suggested. Can mind influence these kinds of random events? So back in the 90s, I did a meta-analysis of the studies that have been done, because 50 years of studies, of dice studies, have been done at that point. So all of the studies combined under control conditions where people are not trying to do anything, that's what you get. And these are 95% error bars. Under experimental conditions where people are trying to influence, you can see that it's nowhere near the control or the baseline, but the effect sizes are very small. It's a real effect, but tiny. And then you can do things like weight the experiments by the experimental quality. And then you could also look at it from the point of view of different experimenters to see whether or not this is independently repeatable. So that all looked pretty good. At one point, some years after they started doing these experiments, it was discovered that if you use regular dice that you'd use in a game, for example, that there are different weights, different mass amount on each face. There's six divots in the 6 side and only 1 on the 1 side. So there's less mass on the 6. So if you repeatedly toss a die that is not perfectly balanced, you're going to end up with a bias. So they started doing experiments with so-called perfect dice, which is what you'd find in casinos, to make sure that each side is weighted the same. And there they found that there actually are differences, still quite significant, except for dice face number 3 for some reason. Both the controls and the experimental results were the same, but for phases 1, 2, and 6, quite strong differences with controls. But you can notice here that because of the way that even with the perfect dice, you even get an effect in the control conditions. So the dice still are not completely perfect when you toss it again and again and again, but you get a difference with experimental results. So these kinds of studies more or less died out by the mid-80s. And the reason is that by the 1970s or so, new methods were developed to create even more random systems. So this is at Princeton University. Their lab there was working for about 30 years. And this was one of their prototype, well, actually their workhorse random number generator that was based on quantum indeterminate events. And so you'd press a button, it would produce 1,000 random bits, and then it would give you the number of whatever the number was. Today, you can buy the same kind of thing in a memory stick format, which is just as good as these prototypes were. Some of them are even better. They're all ultimately based on things like electron tunneling effects rather than things like radioactive decay. So you take one of these devices, you cause it to generate random bits. That's all it does. And it's a random walk. So if you can follow it over time, it'll do what you hope is a random walk. But you give somebody instructions that while this device is running, aim high, make it produce more 1 bits. And if you're lucky, you get this result. And so you repeatedly run the experiment. You ask somebody to aim high and then to aim low, and then you see what you get. So this was part of a 12-year program where hundreds of people did this experiment. For this particular publication, this was 33 people who were selected. And they did a 250,000 trials, each trial including, I think, 1,000 bits that were generated. And so this is the result when they're aiming high. So the probability is up and around 0.001. Here they're aiming low, and there's the baseline. So when you look at the difference between high and low, it's very clear that their intention somehow was being impressed into the probabilities of the output of the random generator. And when the generator was not being intentionally influenced at all as a baseline, it was a random walk. So in 1989, we published this meta-analysis of all of the studies using these random number generators that we could find. We found over 800. And the conclusion was unequivocal positive results in experimental conditions, just as they had reported at Princeton, but these are independent labs around the world. And under chance control conditions, you get chance results that conform very well to a normal curve in a random walk. Some years later, colleagues in Germany did a meta-analysis of a subset of random number generator studies that had been done up to that time. They agreed that there was a significant but very small overall effect size, but they said in principle, the results might be due or could be due to selective reporting, because maybe somebody did an experiment and it didn't work out and they just didn't report it. So we wrote a responder to that. By the way, Psychological Bulletin is one of the top journals in academic psychology. So we wrote a response and we said, well, first of all, they assumed that the mind would influence each random bit uniformly, independently of how fast the bits were being generated. And we pointed out how this is not a very good way of, it's not a good assumption, because you could have a random generator produce 1 bit per second to allow the person to really concentrate on each one, or you could have a random generator produce 1,000,000 bits in a second. And so having the assumption that whatever the mind is doing is influencing each bit the same way is just unlikely. In addition, we're very well aware of other people around the world who have been doing these kinds of experiments, and we calculated how often somebody might not publish something, and we actually contacted everyone and asked, have you ever done one of these random generator studies and not published it? So we're able to get an actual number, and we showed that the actual results of this meta-analysis are extremely unlikely to be due to selective reporting. But it shows that there's interest in this. It was published in Psychological Bulletin. There are different opinions about what the results are. From my perspective, having done such studies and knowing people around the world who have done it, I'm pretty well convinced that this is a real effect. At Princeton, they also did another version of this where they used a Galton board, a quincunx device, to drop polyethylene balls down a chute and then see whether or not, of course, it would eventually form a normal curve. But while that was happening, it took around 10 minutes for all the balls to drop. You give people instructions, now aim to the right, push the balls to the right, push the balls to the left to see if you could see a similar kind of effect in a macroscopic system. There's another view of it. This thing is 8 feet tall. It makes a gigantic racket when it's actually running. And eventually it fills up and you're mentally trying to push it one way or the other. And this is the results of that experiment. So if you're trying to aim right, the balls get pushed to the right. This is a probability of 10 to the minus fourth. You're aiming to the left, it gets pushed almost the same way. And again, if you don't have any aim, it's running around the baseline. So this suggests that even in a macroscopic system, you can see these effects. Again, the magnitude of the effects are pretty small. You can only see these effects with a lot of data, of collected data. So we have a miracle. What is the miracle then that connects mind with matter? So that in order to begin to think about this, one of the approaches that I like to take is to look at the philosophies, because if you start from the wrong philosophy, you will end up with the opinion that these things are impossible. But of course, and the prevailing opinion within science today is reductive materialism, which is set on a bunch of assumptions. Most scientists never think about those assumptions, but of course philosophers do. And when you do start to think about the assumptions of reductive materialism, you begin to realize that it doesn't really account very well for subjective awareness or for consciousness. So we start looking then at the philosophy. So I'm going to use this book by Harold Ottmansbacher and Dean Rickles, which talks about dual aspect monism as a philosophy, way of thinking about how mind and matter interact. So one way of thinking of dual aspect monism is that it's like two sides of the same coin. There's a mind side, there's a matter side. They're intimately correlated with each other, but they're not the same. They are somehow emerging out of this single substrate. I prefer to think of it not so much as a coin, but more like a Klein bottle. And partially because when I think of some sort of amorphous, holistic substance, I can imagine that it twists itself into various kinds of knots. And one of the knots that it could twist itself into is a Klein bottle. So here is what Carl Jung used the term unus mundus, the one world which contains everything. And the outside of the Klein bottle is the objective world that physics likes to study. And the inside of the bottle is the subjective world. But of course, the beauty of a Klein bottle is that there is no inside and outside. It depends more on your perspective of what you're looking at, how you're looking at it. It's all one thing, but it can give the appearance of an outside and an inside. So that's my geometric model of what dual aspect monism is suggesting. So in this book, the way that the authors describe their motivations is that subjectivity, first-person awareness, is self-evident. I mean, for a long time during behaviorism, it wasn't so self-evident, which seems crazy to me, but now most people would agree that, yeah, we have some sort of awareness, but subjectivity is not part of classical mechanics, and it plays not only but it plays a central role in both relativity and quantum mechanics. In addition, other kinds of philosophies like idealism, materialism, panpsychism were deemed too simple to account for the way that the world as we experience it, both in science and experientially, whereas dual aspect monism is more suitable. So it's kind of the Goldilocks approach. And as Ottmansbacher said, it's the confluence of physical science, philosophy, psychology, biology, and theology that is a primary reason for my enthusiasm about dual aspect monism. It provides enough richness to be able to account for all of these disciplines and even beyond, things like mysticism and theology. So where did this come from? Well, as often happens, you start looking in the history of philosophy and you end up with the Greeks. So Parmenides, Plotinus, and then jump a couple of centuries to Spinoza, James, Mach, and Russell. Today we call what they were talking about as neutral monism, in which mind and matter are considered to be separate from each other. They are preformed in this neutral domain, this neutral monist domain. And so in this case, mind and matter are ontic. They are objectively real, they're separate. So that by contrast, in dual aspect monism, mind and matter are not separate. They are entangled epistemic aspects that are split out of this psychophysically neutral domain. And the split occurs depending on context and meaning. So as I was saying with the Klein bottle, there's the appearance that they are separate things, but they're not really separate. They're aspects of something else that is arising out of a neutral domain. This, of course, when Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli were collaborating, that they came up with this notion of synchronicity, a meaningful, acausal coincidence. So it's the coincidences are typically about mind and matter. The connection is acausal, and it's created, or it emerges out of meaning. That's what makes it a synchronicity. And interestingly, Pauli was very interested in the work of J.B. Rhine, who we already met, who was doing work with ESP at the time, because he felt that the idea that they had come up with essentially was a kind of a controlled synchronicity. That, in other words, that ESP was a kind of created, in quotes, synchronicity. That it's acausal. We don't know why these things would occur, whether with tossing of dice or using of random generators or even an ESP test. But nevertheless, it's as though it's a synchronicity that has a certain kind of meaning in it, which I'll go into in a bit. The other thing, the second dyad that is considered within the dual aspect monism book is from Basil Hiley and David Bohm, who, of course, came up with their idea of an implicate order and an explicate order, and somehow mind and matter split out of the implicate order and also have back reaction. So it's a dynamic going back and forth, like a vortex or something between these two different orders. And I'll just point out that for Jung, it's the unus mundus, this implicate order. For Bohm and Hiley, they use words like pre-space. We'll see in a minute that Eddington and Wheeler use words like spiritual world and pre-geometry. So there are lots of words that physicists, and in the case of Jung, psychiatrists, use to describe this underlying substrate of what is it where things can emerge from. So here's Eddington and Wheeler. This was the third dyad that is used in this book of dual aspect monism. And as they say, Atmansbacher said that neither Eddington nor Wheeler used observer in the orthodox sense, as in like a measuring instrument. Instead, they implied the existence of a mental or conscious state of an agent capable of registering measurement outcomes in the world, and whose own faculties, meaning their consciousness, play a role in what those outcomes are, and a co-creation of the world through the subject-object interface. Eddington again, for his direct quote, "There's a world beyond this that has a kind of potential reality only and is brought to life, as it were, by the operation of a mind. The mind is thus implicated in building the very world it observes." Wheeler said something very similar. The observer is as essential to the creation of the universe as the universe is to the creation of the observer. So in a nutshell then, as Jung said, mind and matter are two different aspects of one and the same thing, is unus mundus. The mind and matter are connected acausally by meaning. And in particular, they are correlated beyond ordinary space-time. Well, that's essentially a definition of entanglement. Entanglement is an acausal connection. It is a correlation, an acausal correlation, but is not chance either. So you can immediately start to see then why some kind of phenomena that people report start to show a resemblance to this sequence of ideas here. So another way of getting into this, and I'm using this book by Rosenblum and Kuttner, talking about physics and consciousness. So one way that to motivate it is to say, well, we want to see a butterfly. So a photon hits a butterfly. So there's our wave packet that we can describe as a photon. And the camera sees that and it's displayed on a screen, and then your eye sees the screen and your brain processes the information, and somehow we magically see a butterfly. So you can take a quantum mechanical approach and create a matrix, which describes the photon and the camera and a display and an eye and a brain. Why? Because they're all physical objects. So they all have quantum mechanical descriptions. So when the photon interacts with the camera, how do you describe that? Well, you take the tensor product of the two matrices, and then you keep doing this. And so we get all the way down to the brain, and all you have is a very, very complicated matrix, still a quantum potential. It's not the actual thing yet. So this is why John Bell actually made this sketch to illustrate what he called the chain. How does the chain break from quantum potentials into classical actuals? Where does it happen? Because so far, everything that we saw was physical, except maybe for the person's experience, their subjective experience. Maybe that's where the chain breaks. So this problem was thought about by many people, including John von Neumann, who proposed that the measurement chain ends only when knowledge of the measurement is registered by an extra physical factor, which by he meant consciousness. Something about subjectivity breaks the chain. And he wasn't alone in this. Of course, Max Planck is well known for being one of the idealists who founded quantum mechanics. And many of the other founders of quantum mechanics and developers of quantum mechanics had the same opinions, all the way up to the present day. So here's an interesting way of looking at a snapshot as of 2016. So this was a survey sent to 1,200 physicists at 8 universities, and 149 responded. And they were asked a bunch of questions about what they were thinking about fundamentals in physics. And so, in your opinion, the observer is a complex quantum system. Most people said yes. Should play no fundamental role whatsoever in quantum mechanics. Plays a fundamental role, but no distinguished physical role or a distinguished physical role. So this would be where we'd put people like von Neumann, that the observer in this case plays a distinguished physical role. And not only von Neumann, but as we've already seen, Eddington, Wheeler, Basel, Bohm, and Young, and Pauli, and many others. So roughly 1 in 5 physicists today think that they were right. Only 10% say that the observer should play no fundamental role whatsoever. So the first thing you can see from all this is that there are quite a few people who actually think this is sort of important. And the second thing is that there's no great consensus yet about what the right answer is. This is beginning to influence philosophers as well. So here are a 2009 survey and 2020 survey of English-speaking philosophers. What's your current preferred way of understanding the mind? So here's 2009, 2020. So 2009, 57% were thinking of it in physicalistic terms. It's down 5% by 2020. And you get exactly the opposite. For people thinking in non-physical terms, 27%, now up to 32%. So as pointed out by Ottmansbacher, that philosophies are influenced by physics and vice versa. They go hand in hand and they pay attention to each other. So we're beginning to see a slow movement away from physicalism and towards a non-physicalistic way of thinking about the mind. And as a cartoon way of thinking of it, that the deeper that we examine the physical world, the more it's dissolving into abstractions until all that's left are possibilities, information, relationships, consciousness, perhaps. So from all of this, we can create a hypothesis. The hypothesis is that mind and matter are acausally connected by meaning. Well, that's a testable hypothesis. We can mentally intend that a physical target changes its behavior as compared to a no intention control condition. The meaning is assigned by the definition of the experimental protocol. It's also assigned by the purpose and the importance of the study, both to the experimenters and to the participants. Well, physicists are paying attention. They may not be thinking about dual aspect monism, but they know that the study of these kinds of questions is important. So here's Lucian Hardy at Perimeter Institute, who's talking about a classic quantum test that could reveal the limits of the human mind. And he says, a Bell test experiment using something unprecedented, human consciousness. If such an experiment showed deviations from quantum mechanics, it could provide the first hints that our minds are potentially immaterial. Likewise, Gießen, University of Geneva, said if somebody does the experiment and gets a surprising result, the reward is enormous. It would be the first time we as scientists can put our hands on this problem of consciousness, to which I would respond, well, it would not exactly be the first time, because we've already seen cases where people have been doing this for decades. So that gets us into empiricism. So one of the experiments, I'm going to mainly talk about experiments that I've done myself with my colleagues. There are many, many others I could talk about, but because I don't have 15 hours to talk and a limited amount of time, I'm going to focus on what I know best. So I've decided that I wanted to see if von Neumann was right. Does the quantum systems collapse as a result of consciousness? So I made a double slit optical system. And as we're all well aware, if you don't know what's going on with the photons, you get an interference pattern. And if you do, you don't get an interference pattern. So that made a nice distinction that you could test. So here's the system. And the only thing I added to this system was a person who was assigned the role of using their mind to either see where the photons were going, so to gain which path information, or to mentally push the photon so they'd only go through one slit, or do anything they could think of that would interfere with what the photons were doing, because any form of interference would actually cause the interference pattern to begin to collapse. So this is the mind side of the experiment. Here's the matter side. And this is the meaning. The meaning is assigned by feedback, real-time feedback that we give about an aspect of the interference pattern. So the protocols in almost all of the studies I'm going to talk about are more or less the same. You look at interference during mental observation versus times when there's no observation. So in this case, you observe for 30 seconds with your mind, and then you withdraw your mind for 30 seconds plus a random amount. We always put a random jitter in there to avoid the possibility that there's some cycling going on in the physical system that you accidentally couple to. So we decouple it by putting in this random timing. And then you repeat this. So you do it again and again over 20 minutes or so. So we're interested in the differential measure. What is happening in the interference pattern while a person's observing versus resting? And I emphasize, they're not looking with their eye. They're looking with their mind's eye. That's the only thing they're allowed to use. Because among other things, the optical system is sealed. It's sealed shut. You can't see inside it. So the prediction is a mental observation will reduce interference. So we use a line camera to look at the interference pattern, and the double slit is actually on this little slide over here. And that's what it looks like when the whole thing is sealed up. This is a helium neon tube. It actually goes up to about halfway into this box. There I am fiddling with some of the components, putting it back together. So this is what the camera sees, alternating bands of light and dark. If you look at this from a graph point of view, here's the classic interference pattern. And you take a Fourier transform. This is one of the ways that I looked at this, to take a real-time Fourier transform for every snapshot. So we were taking something like 20 snapshots per second. And so 20 times a second, you'd get a Fourier transform, and this peak is the double slit interference. So in other words, this fast-moving pattern there is that peak. So we can use this peak as a way of measuring how much interference is going on. And the idea is that when you're observing, this peak will change. Initially we thought it would go down. The interference would decline, so this would go down, and now you withdraw your mind and it would go back up. We did a bunch of pilot tests to see how do we really engage people in this experiment and look at other various aspects of it. So here's all participants in green. There are people who are non-meditators, people who are meditators. And as you see overall, and by the way, these are controls, so they're running the same system, but with no observers doing anything. What we found again and again is meditators are pretty good at this. It is not, I don't think because meditators have special powers, but because they're able to do the task, which is attend for 30 seconds on something that you can't see over there. So it's kind of an abstract task, but meditators have attention training, and that's what this kind of experiment requires. So overall, here's overall result. These are 1 standard error bars, so you can see that it's not too bad. Meditators are about 5 sigma away from chance. Meditators didn't do so good, and the control includes chance. So we were encouraged by this and presented it to some of our colleagues, and they said, well, just do a formal experiment, do a pre-planned experiment with pre-planned number of people and so on, using the best analytical method that you have come up with so far. So we did that, and we predicted reduced interference, and we got a almost 4.5, 5 sigma result, which we were quite pleased with. We published this in 2012. So we also did another analysis in that experiment that if you look at the interference pattern, you could use it for a transform as we did, but you could also just look at where the peaks and the troughs are. So we predicted that the trough should go up because if the interference pattern collapses, what actually happens here is that these bottom parts begin to creep up and the peak will start to go down. So the top and the bottom will slowly start to approach each other. So we predicted this effect, and in fact, that's what we got. We also got small effects in the same direction, but not statistically significant in the control condition. So one of the things that came up here is we had people within 2 meters of our double slit system. And anyone who's worked with interferometers know that these things are incredibly sensitive to everything. So we thought, well, maybe what's going on here is that when we asked people to mentally aim at the target, that they leaned forward a little bit. And that would increase the temperature by a very tiny amount, but it would increase the temperature on the interferometer. And maybe that's why we saw the effect that we did. And then when they relaxed, they would lean back. So we said, okay, we need to do an experiment where they're nowhere near the physical target. So we put a version of this online. So we ran this for 3 years, and we ended up with 4,500 sessions where humans were observing the system on their browser, and 7,000 sessions that were run as controls where we had a computer simulate a person who was going to the website and then doing the experiment. But of course, there was nobody there, it's just a computer. So we had a very nice way of simulating humans and having actual humans. So the way it worked would look like this. You go to a web browser, you would see under no observing condition, it would just say, please relax, and you'd see just a blue rectangle. And on the observing condition, it would speak to you, now please concentrate, try to make the line move up, and you would see the line in real time be moving up. Or moving, I mean, the goal was make it move up with your mind. So then we also had a Linux system, which is programmed to simulate a human. So in the non-observing and observing, it just was pulling in data. So in this case, we used fringe visibility as the metric, which is just the maximum versus the minus the minimum in this way. It's a fractional way of saying how sharp are the fringes. So we predicted that the fringes would become squished, just as I mentioned before, during observation. So collapse interference while observing. So this is the result when people are observing these black dots. And as you can see by the z-scores, you can think of these as sigma if you like. So somewhere around 3 to 5 sigma drops in the interference in the fringes, which we had predicted. And when the Linux system was watching, basically is hovering around chance. So we're pleased with that. So it looked like the interference pattern actually did collapse during observation, but only by humans. The other nice thing about this experiment is we had the IP address of everybody who did the experiment. So we knew the distance of each person to our laboratory in California. So here's our lab over here. People are minimum of about kilometer away because we didn't have people come to the lab to do this. They had to do it with their browser. And so these are people mostly in the United States, and these are people in Europe and people in Asia. The farthest away from our lab was in South America or South Africa, almost 18,000 kilometers away. So we had people from all over the place. This green line would be what you'd expect by chance, and this red line is what we actually saw. And the red line would tell us if there's a decline by distance, and it is flat to 6 decimal places. So as best as we could tell, this effect, whatever's going on here, is independent of distance. Then somebody said, well, you're using a gazillion photons per second by using a continual beam laser. What does this work with single photons too? So we got a device that does single photons. The way it works is you have a tiny little bulb, so an incandescent bulb. You could do it with a laser as well, but then you can't get single photons. So you use this tiny incandescent bulb. It goes through a double slit. There's a slit blocker, so you can decide where you want to pull out just those photons. And then another slit to decide which portion of the interference pattern you want to see, because the double slit creates it over here. And then it goes into a photomultiplier, and you count the number of photons that you're getting. So this is what it looks like in the lab. The person in this case would be inside our 2-ton solid steel, double-walled, shielded room. This is one side of the box and the other side of the box, so you'd be 2.5 meters away while doing this experiment. The whole apparatus is sitting on a vibration isolation table, and the box itself is kind of an isolation table because it's so heavy, it weighs so much. On top of this, this tube here, where the photons are going, is a little Buddha statue. We use this as in one of our experiments. We call it the illuminated Buddha. So in this experiment, we set it up in such a way that if you were successful, you would actually increase the number of photons that you would end up with. And if that happened, the number of photons was driving a little LED, which was inside the Buddha doll. So the better you were doing at the experiment, the brighter the Buddha would get. And people love this as a form of feedback, because during the no interaction period, the room was completely dark, no light at all. The Buddha was turned off. So the only way you could get light was during the concentration periods and by increasing the photon count so as to illuminate the Buddha. And it gave a nice sort of saffron color also when it was illuminated. So the reason I say this is because, as I'll mention later, these are not just physics experiments. You're dealing with people who are asked to do something which is generally somewhat abstract. So we've tried many, many different ways to try to engage the person in the experiment because of the meaning aspect, which seemed to be so critical in dual aspect monism, that you have mind and you have matter, and they could appear to be quite different unless you can connect them by meaning. So it's through these kinds of feedback methods that we've been able to manipulate the concept of meaning. So first of all, I wanted to check, are we really seeing an interference pattern? Yes. You can move the slit on the photomultiplier and look at different portions of the pattern. And you can see here, it absolutely is getting an interference pattern with single photons. These are the error bars. Error bars are so small you can't even see them down here. So our target then, we had 20 participants, each doing one session, and we only gave them feedback on that trough. So if they were successful, that trough would begin to move up, and in the experiment, they were successful. They got a z-score of 2.5 or a probability of about 0.01. So we were happy to see that. During that experiment, we also took 32 channels of EEG because we're interested in seeing, given that there were 20 and 30-second periods where people had a focus, were they doing that? Like, how can you tell, other than asking somebody, that you were actually doing the task? So this is a way of, at least indirectly, seeing, were they doing something according to what we were asking them to do? So we're able to look at the change in alpha power. And I'll explain in a minute why we did that. But there are different periods that the computer would say, get ready to concentrate. Okay, now concentrate on the target. And when you do that, you can see very clearly, this is averaged across all the people, that they're in a state of high alpha, and then the alpha goes away. And when the alpha goes away, it's called desynchronization, and that is showing a shift of attention. So that's an easy marker way to say there's a shift of attention. So we're mainly interested in alpha power. We looked at other bands as well. So this is now looking at the average photon count rate and how it changed. So there's no difference positive, which is in the direction that we were hoping to see, and negative. We separated it according to what kind of alpha power we were seeing. So here's people were relaxing, they get the instruction, get ready, and now concentrate. So what we see here is when alpha power decreased, we saw an increase in focused attention, or at least an increase that attention had shifted. And sure enough, we get our large rise, or relatively large rise, these are 1 standard error bars, in the photon counts. And by contrast, sometimes they said concentrate and actually showed no increase or even a decrease. So alpha is increasing, meaning they probably fell asleep or something, and there's a drop. So the difference between these two at the moment that they're beginning to concentrate is quite dramatic. But as you notice, both of them start to converge after a while. And from this, we were able to see that people could do this task for about 10 seconds, and then even trained meditators couldn't sustain it. It's like it's too abstract. Even with the Buddha doll, they found it very difficult to sustain. This is one of the reasons why these experiments need an enormous amount of data, and even better, to select people who you've already tested to see that they can actually do the task, because lots of people actually can only do it for like 2 seconds, and it's just not enough to see an effect. Well, the next question that could arise is, well, is this effect causal? So this is a complicated experiment, and I don't have time to go through all the details, but I'll just say, I'll talk about it like this, that in biology experiments, to see whether an effect, like a compound that you're using with cells, whether it actually has an effect, you use what's called positive and negative controls. So we did that in this experiment. There was quite a clever design proposed to us by the funder of this experiment. So with an X meaning the concentrate period and O meaning relax, you do pairs. You do a pair of 30 seconds of relax followed by 30 seconds of relax. You look at the differential effect from that, it should be nothing. But if you look at the way that the interference pattern would change, the fringes should increase, like the peak should increase during this null condition. And then you have 2 periods of concentrating, in which case the mean should decline. You should see a squish of the interference pattern. And so, and by the way, these means are associated with the overall grand mean. So in relationship to the overall grand mean, it would go up, it would go down here. And then you have conditions which are relax followed by concentrate and concentrate followed by relax. So you can make a prediction that the difference here should be positive and the difference there should be negative. So from all of this, you can make a model. So you get null effect, null effect. This is for these pairs. So you get null, null, positive, negative. Here it is, null, null, positive, negative. And then positive, positive, negative, negative, positive, and so on. So you have 12 elements in this ideal model of what you would expect to happen if you're really pushing things around the way that we hope it would happen. So I'm putting here a causal influence. Actually, I think more of it as a kind of an acausal effect from a dual aspect monism perspective, but nevertheless, it has the word cause in there. Something is happening. So this is the way, here's the interference pattern. Here's the Fourier transform. If you look only at that dot, this is wave number 42, which is the peak of the Fourier transform for the double slit, you get this. And you have 2 bands here, and this is caused by something called mode hopping in gas lasers. So we're using a helium neon gas laser, and it's jumping back and forth between 2 different power modes. That makes the statistical analysis difficult because this introduces a huge amount of noise. So we developed lots of different ways of trying to deal with this without having to simply get rid of half of the data. And one approach that we found that worked pretty good was to take this middle section, which is mostly noise, of the Fourier transform and simply flatten it, make it linearly detrend it. And when you do that, and now you're looking only at that one dot at 42, it's pretty well behaved. You get this in graph number E. It's pretty well behaved. It's almost normal, but you can then do statistics with that. So you get, unfortunately, when you do this experiment, looking at the model results and everything, you don't get anything. You get a null result. So we weren't too happy with that. So I revisited this idea and said, well, that's interesting, except that it distorted the spectrum. And so now it's not entirely clear what we're measuring anymore. So I thought, okay, let's think of a way that doesn't distort the Fourier transform, because if you take this distorted spectrum and you then go backwards to try to figure out what the interference pattern looked like, it's also really distorted in order to get that distribution. So I wanted to keep the original distribution and said, okay, well, we'll just take the right half of this Fourier transform, just average the whole thing together. Because most of this is noise, but here's, as you can see, it's not a spike. Actually, the spectral has a distribution to it. Okay, so we take that, and that works out pretty good. Not only does it give you a very nice, well-behaved distribution, but the results are significant. So again, here's our ideal model. This is that model. Here's what the actual data looks like, and you do a Spearman correlation. Turns out to be quite significant. We're actually getting results based on a model which looks much closer to the way that the original interference pattern looked, which suggests that somehow the mind is pushing the system around exactly in the way that you would predict. This experiment also had a sham condition, which was run with the person outside of the room, but using the exact same protocol as the experiment. Because, just to back up for a second, this sequence, the O's and the X's, were randomly scrambled for each new person doing a session. So the sham used the same random sequence. So the sham was as close as we thought we could get to the experimental session, and there you don't get a significant correlation. We also tested, does talent matter? We selected people who we thought would do well, but it's hard to select. People don't feel well one day and they don't do so well. So what we did is we had 25 subjects in this experiment, each did 10 sessions. We got the people the 5 best performers and took their 5 first sessions. We based that on their 5 first sessions. So we selected out people who did really well. And then we looked at their last 5 sessions to see if what they had done well in the beginning lasted for the remainder 5 sessions, and it did. They continued to do well. So there was some element of talent going on here. And the people who did not do well did not continue to do well, and they got a non-significant result. And if you do the same thing for the sham data, both of those showed nothing interesting. So this suggests that talent does matter in these kinds of experiments. But then we also compared the variance of the data in the sham condition versus the experimental, and we found a whoppingly different effect. So again, the sham condition was exactly the same as experimental, but no one was in the chamber while they were doing the sham. And so what we find here is that there was much greater variance when people were in the chamber doing the experiment, which you can interpret one way as it was an artifact, that their body heat or whatever was influencing them. But there's another way to imagine what's going on here, because if the people were actually modulating the system, that is exactly what we were predicting. So we have a confound between the mind was producing the effect versus the body. And so as a pilot study, this taught us a number of very interesting things, like ways of doing better analysis. And also, if you're doing an experiment of this type, you need to have the person in the same location during a sham condition as you do during an experimental condition. Otherwise, you can't discriminate between what's happening. So we've gone on to build a number of other kinds of double slit systems. This one's built completely out of Thorlab components, and it's pretty easy to put together. It's not cheap, which is one of the reasons why it's been difficult to get others to replicate it. Fortunately, there have been a few. So here's Gabriel Gruer, a physicist who was working at CERN, who became quite interested in this line of research and came to our lab and visited for a month to look at our materials, to look at our experimental setup, and to look at the data. He thought it was interesting, so he went back to Sao Paulo and built his own version in the lab, made his own Faraday cage around the setup. And so he reported this, submitted, I think, but it's not published yet. So 6 exploratory mode experiments, very similar to what we had done, got statistically significant unidirectional differences, almost identical to what we had observed. When I heard from him after he did this, he was like, his head was exploding. Then he did 3 formal experiments, so pre-planned experiments. They were not statistically significant in the unimodal difference, but they were significant when evaluated as a bidirectional or a variance measure. And I'm going to return to this because we see this again and again. And we at this point think we understand why this is happening. The other person is Nicolas Tremblay, also a physicist from France, who came and spent a month with us to look at our online data. So we gave him all of our data from these 2 years of experiments. And also Wolfgang Baer, who's a physicist at the Naval Postgraduate School. We gave him the same data, and he again did an independent analysis and verified that the results that we reported were correct. So Nicholas ultimately published his analysis in PLOS One and concluded significant, although small, anomalies in the direction predicted by the mind-matter interaction hypothesis. 2 years later, he published a correction where he found the shifts in the fringe visibility were in the direction expected, but not significant. Why did he see that? Because it turned out that one of the methods we used to do outlier rejection conflated or inflated the results, But fortunately, we presented a whole variety of different analyses, some not using any outlier rejection, and it was still significant. He also got to this conclusion because in his method of testing, he tested hundreds of combination of different parameters, which is acceptable. But when you adjust for multiple analyses, it reduces the statistical power so much that he ended up with nothing significant anymore. So that was his decision of how he wanted to do it. And so that's what he did. So we were grateful that he found that this outlier method that we were using, outlier rejection, actually was not so good. But again, fortunately, it didn't affect our primary results. So independent replication 2, we discovered this in 2019, a group from, I believe, a university in Serbia. Our hypothesis, observing in a state of focused attention causes wave function collapse and double slit of diffraction. They cited one of my early studies as the motivation for doing this. They had 26 participants. They concluded significant quantum entanglement between the brain and an external double slit system. I have to admit that the methods that they used, I understand it, like 80% of it, but I don't completely understand what they did. But that's the results that they got, and they managed to publish it. So I take that as a replication. So these are all the studies that have been using interference patterns or interferometers, optical interferometers. When you look at the ones just using double slits, 30 experiments reported so far, 14 get results at least at the 0.05 level, which if you look at an exact binomial probability of that, it's around a 6 sigma result. So it kind of looks at this point like something interesting is going on. Only 2 completely independent experimental tests so far, and both of them report interesting results. So the experimental task in what I've described so far requires focused attention. So the question is, does mind wandering cause this to be a non-stable influence? Well, as I showed you in the EEG, it's difficult even for people who are experienced at these kinds of mental tasks to maintain focus for long. And for people who have less experience, their minds are fluctuating all over the place. So what if we use a variant shift model, like a bidirectional hypothesis, rather than a mean shift? So we took the data from this one experiment, 2016, and we applied the variance measure to it between attention toward versus attention away. And so the attention toward, no question that there's a significant change, and under control conditions, there's not. So we published this last year. So I think I'm going to stop at this point. This is a nice place to stop. And I'm going to talk about, we'll take a 10-minute break. When I come back, we could either do Q&A on what I presented, or I can keep going because there's a whole bunch of additional experiments involving photons and other kinds of targets that I can go through, and I'll let the audience decide what they want to hear. So let's take a break at this point.
You have time for a quick question?
Sure.
So I was, you were speaking about the 2 states of the observer, one being relaxed and one being concentrated. Now, I was wondering, I mean, for me, concentration is kind of an exclusion. So I'm like focusing on something and excluding other information. And if you take the analogy to playing in an orchestra, which you did, I mean, if you just concentrate on your own piece, your own music, then you won't be in coherence with the whole musical piece because you'll just be concentrated. So you kind of have to zoom out to become like an integral part of the whole movement. And it seems like this zooming out and becoming more aware, with all your senses, with your eyes, with your ears and everything like that, just leads to, a whole system becoming alive and becoming whole and coherent. So, but the essential intention, which is there, is like, okay, we're going to make some music, we're going to make something beautiful. And like, in your experiment, there's the intention, okay, we're going to see if there's going to be some kind of, effect. So I was wondering if instead of the movement of concentration, which is, exclusion, as I was saying, because even in the music, if you also integrate the audience, if you bring the audience, if you become aware of the audience as well, and you just expand your awareness of everything that's going on, then it's, it's just this, it's just beautiful creation. I mean, it's just, so I wonder if in that experimental setting, if the inputs would be, and this is hard to test, but I mean, if I would like have more inputs of my whole surrounding and not this exclusion, but integration, if that would have an effect on, on the experimental process, I guess I don't know if you get my gist.
Yes, no, I do. So it's a testable idea. And what you're pointing out is the constraints involved in doing an experiment.
Yeah.
Right. You have to figure out some way of doing this. And what I really wanted to tell people is to be one with the optical system.
Right.
But unless they're a meditator or know about what that even means, it would be confusing. So I tried to make it as simple as possible, even for meditators to understand, because, you don't meditate generally with an optical system. So I had to figure out some way of talking about it.
Okay.
Could I follow that up with a very brief question? Which is similar.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a non-scientist, but from experience, I know that if I'd been focusing intensely on a problem, very often I hit my head against a brick wall. I just don't get it. I don't solve the problem, but it's in the times when I relax after concentration that something may well come through. And I think in the history of science, or at least in the anecdotal, the anecdotes about the history of science, we have similar accounts. There's the famous Archimedes relaxing his bath, or the apple dropping on the head. So do you have any way of measuring that effect? In other words, relaxation following a period of intense focus on a particular issue?
Well, yeah, it is known in this business of something called the release of effort effect.
Right.
And you can set up an experiment with that as the target of as the effect of interest. You can do that.
Nice.
Again, for purposes of simplicity in the experimental protocol, I wanted this to be as close as you can get it, as you would find in a physics lab, where you have a photodiode versus no photodiode, or you have the photodiode on versus not on. And in this case, using the mind, kind of like switching it one way or the other, recognizing that, as you said, there are things like release of effort. There are lots of ways of doing this, but I was trying to keep it simple. And partially because I'm doing these experiments and mainly publishing them in physics journals, because I don't want to confuse physicists too much about the fact that we're actually dealing with the mind, which is way more complex than any form of physical apparatus you can find.
Right.
In the lab, anyway.
So does intuition come in at all to your experimentation?
Of course, yeah, certainly in the part of the experimenters and figuring out what to do and how to do it and which people to select to do it. Yeah, it's a very important component. It's not quite scientific yet to admit that you use intuition, but of course, every experimentalist and every theorist does too. So
Thank
let me keep going here.
Please keep going, Dean. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll talk about other experiments involving photons. So we've already met Schrodinger's cat. And so the question is, can mental observation help the cat survive? No cats were harmed in this experiment. So we did this using a Michelson interferometer. This is inside our shielded room. This is the interferometer itself is pretty small, but I just blew up the side so you could see what was going on. So there's a target area. We asked meditators outside the room to put their mind into one of the arms and block it. So that they weren't even inside the chamber. And we have a camera looking at the interference pattern, which in this case would be like a circle. And it's inside, again, our 2-ton solid steel chamber, and the meditator's outside of the chamber. So here's what the interferometer looks like. There's a beam that comes in that way. It bounces back, and that's what causes the interference pattern. And the target was here. So we showed people, put your mind there, block it somehow with your mind. When both of the arms of the interferometer are open, you get this wavy pattern. If one of the arms is closed, you get a smooth pattern. So again, it's a differential experiment. If there's no differential effect, it's going to be flat. If there is a differential effect, it's a difference between these two patterns on the top. So you get this upside down ripply pattern. So that's what we were hoping to see in this experiment. So same protocols as before, observe, rest. Under calibration conditions, it's completely flat. You don't see anything. When we have a meditator do it, we got the upside down ripply pattern, suggesting that something about what, in this case, Swami Veda did, blocked one of the arms of the interferometer. So we took a little picture of what was happening when he was observing the system mentally versus not observing. And it's an interesting, almost like a heartbeat going on. So something was happening when he was mentally putting his mind in that beam as compared to not putting it in the beam. So this is what the camera is seeing. This is the interference pattern. You can't see the whole thing here, and the color is showing the degree of how illuminated the pattern is. So there's some kind of throbbing going on. So it's an anecdote about Swami Veda. So Swami Veda, when we met him, had been meditating for something like 70 years. He started when he was 10. And we asked him, how did you send your mind into the shielded room in that spot? How did you do that? And he said, pointing to his heart, the universe is inside. It's not out there. There is no out there. It's all inside. And he took a while to find where that part was inside this inner universe. He said it took about, the session was 20 minutes. It took about 10 minutes, he estimated, for him to find where that was in this inner universe. When he did that, we had 2 videographers taking pictures of him and me, and we couldn't see inside the shielded room at the time, but these 2 videographers and myself were in the room with him. Around halfway through that 20-minute session, I happened to mention that I felt very disoriented about halfway through. I don't know why, I just kind of lost what I was doing. I forgot what I was doing. Some weird dissociation happened for a few seconds. And both of the videographers said the same thing. So, I mean, I said this without knowing anything about their experience, but they both had the same experience. Roughly halfway through the experiment or through that session, which is when we saw this effect, like that heart beating effect, all of us suddenly became disoriented, as though we physically or mentally felt something weird happening. So we did nine meditators, 9 non-meditators. Once again, all of the action in this was in the meditators, a very strong statistical effect, and nothing with the non-meditators. So what about entangled photons? Well, we use this nice equipment from a company in Munich called Q-Tools, and in particular their QUED system, which creates entangled photons, about 1,000 per second. So it works in the way you would create entangled photons. You take a high energy blue photon, goes through a beta barium borate crystal, nonlinear crystal, and it produces 2 red photons. So by the way this thing is devised, the lasers inside that thing, so the 2 red photons come out at a certain angle, they bounce off of these mirrors, they go into polarizers, the polarizers can turn, but then it sends the results with fiber optics from each of these two polarizers, and it can go through a total of 16 different angles. And so the reason you're doing this is because, and by the way, the photons end up through the fiber optics into a coincidence counter. And you do this because if you were dealing with classical particles, you would end up with a correlation like this, depending on the two different polarizing angles. But entangled particles, you get stronger correlations. So that's entangled particles. So you use this method. This is the only equation I show. This is the Clauser-Horn-Shimonian-Holt method, which has been mentioned previously as a way of showing that something's entangled. And you go through all the math here, and you end up with a value called S, correlation strength. A classical value of S for classical particles is less than 2. If it's quantum, it's between 2 and 2 square roots of 2. And this QUED machine produces an S value of about 2.5 with a very small error bar. So it is definitely entangled photons. We're also interested in what we call supraquantum. Can we mentally push the S value to be a stronger correlation than what's called the Cyrelson bound? So Cyrelson was a Russian mathematician who came up with the upper bound of entanglement strength according to orthodox quantum mechanics. So we thought, well, if we can modulate entanglement strength with our minds, which was the main hypothesis, could we push it beyond the Cyrelson bound? Because if we could, it would mean that the mind somehow is producing some effect that is beyond orthodox quantum mechanics. So this is the kind of data you get when you run this machine. Here's our S values, and you see it kind of flips and flops all over the place. And the intention is to increase the value of S. So same protocols as before, periods of intending, periods of not intending, and so on. So if you figure out what you would expect if you're really able to do this, for reasons that take too long to describe, you'd end up with something that looks like this shape. You'd end up with something that looks very much like a sine wave shape. This would be how you would modulate the S value. So we did 4 experiments. 3 were done in our laboratory. 1 with the same kind of machine and software was done with a colleague in France. We had first 7 participants and then 1 participant who did well. And then in France, they had 16 people doing it. Otherwise, most of the rest of the protocols were about the same. Number of trials about the same. So here's the hypothetical prediction. This is what we got for the studies at ions, for the 3 studies we did at ions. So the jagged black line is what we actually got. The cosine fit to it, as you see, is very close. And the SEC is the predicted effect, is this sine wave there. So it's phase shifted a little bit. And we do look at the probability overall. For the studies we did at ions, extremely strong evidence that we were able to modulate the S value, which is interesting. In France, they did not get a significant result when we combined all of our data. It still ended up with significance, but mainly because we had such a strong result at the ions lab. And we did the same thing as controls, and overall we see nothing. In this case, for the controls with ions, we did have someone in the room with the apparatus just to make sure that the experiments and the controls were being run in approximately the same way. The question still always is, maybe there's something about the entanglement that the proximity of the body made a difference, so we put it online. We ran this apparatus continuously for a period of around, I forget whether it's 3 or 6 months, but this thing is not really made to run continuously, but we did it anyway. And we had periods where people were watching by going onto the website and doing the experiment, and equal periods where nobody was looking at it at all, but the machine was still producing data. So we had very nice control again, observers watching, no observers. So the way we worked is the machine is sending data up to the Amazon cloud. It goes into a database. Somebody comes into a website and they pull data. And this is all happening in real time. They pull data and they could have multiple people pulling the same data at the same time, operating 24/7. And you could have lots of people doing the same experiment at the same time. Mostly it was just one. So that was the website. When you go to the website, you'd see a graph being drawn in real time, and the instruction while concentrating is to mentally push this thing up which would mean that the S value is going up. We also had another display, if they preferred, you'd see a bunch of dynamically moving bubbles, and your goal was to make the bubbles coherent, to kind of mentally pull it down and be coherent so they would stay together as a ring. So this is the results. When observers are present, you get a significant result. When nobody was watching at all, but the machine's running all by itself, you don't get a significant result. So then the question is, could we push the S value beyond 2 square roots of 2, the Cyrelson bound? And the answer was no, we couldn't. And the reason is, in this experiment, the apparatus itself was not sensitive enough to be able to measure S values that high. So unless we did a complete miracle, and was able to make the machine work beyond the way it was designed, we wouldn't have been able to push beyond the Cyrelson bound. So that didn't work. So next thing, photon polarization. So we set up this thing. So we have a laser. So it sends a straight through shot. We call this the standard beam, which measures the power of the laser, goes through a half silver mirror. Then it bounces off a full mirror, goes through a vertical and a horizontal polarizer. It also bounces here. And so we get a bounce beam, a control beam, which is actually right smack in the middle there. We get the polarized beam, which passes through 2 polarizers. And here's the mental target, just like we did with Swami Veda. We say, put your mind in here and block it, twist it, do whatever you want, and change the polarization of the photons. And so the way I describe to people is, imagine you can grab the beam with your mind and actually twist it. And if you did that, you would actually increase the amount of light coming through, because vertical and horizontal polarizers that are crossed will not allow any light to go through. So here, normally you get very close to 0 illumination. We figured if you're able to do this with your mind, that it would increase the amount of light that you see. So with focused mental attention, put in this spot, increase the polarized beam illumination because you were twisting it or changing the polarization. So that's what the apparatus looked like, different beams. This, by the way, we went to a diode laser. At this point, frequency and temperature stabilized, 100-meter coherence length, a very expensive and very good laser to get around this issue that we had with the previous tests using mode hopping gas lasers. So it's a very stable system. We put it inside this shielded box. We had mu metal inside. It's on the vibration isolation table. The subject would get feedback by the shape of this, the data. And again, concentrate, relax periods, and it's superimposed over the data itself. So in the control conditions, no observers are present, 15 sessions. With the control, the bounce, and the polarized beams, as compared to the standard beam, you don't get anything. When people are watching, something interesting happens. But instead of the polarized beam increasing, it substantially to 6 sigma decreased. And so this was a surprise. We did not expect this. We didn't even know how to interpret it, but it was such a strong effect. We did another experiment, we replicated it and got the same result. So with a wholly newly designed system. So that was our response. Now what? So we had to create an experiment to see, well, where it happened to the missing photons? That maybe the mind got in there and it absorbed the photons or scattered them or something, but not enough went through the second polarizer. So here's Lauren Carpenter making the new scattering photon experiment. That's what it looked like when it was put together. So what's going on here is a cooled camera at the top of this apparatus, a highly reflective chamber that the beam passes through, a diode that will pick up anything that did not pass through, but just reflected around inside there, and then the very stable laser. And the idea was when people are observing, you get a significant increase in light seen at the top, which means more light passing directly through. So not seeing scattering. And when in no observing condition, you end up with slightly the opposite effect, but not significant. So under control conditions, where again, somebody was there, but they're just reading a book, no difference in either of these. So something peculiar happened in this experiment, which again was not what we expected because we didn't see any scattering. What we were not able to test in this was whether the photons were absorbed, because the target for the person was put your mind inside this ball. So if the photons were being absorbed inside the ball, you would expect that the amount of light that would be seen at the top would go down, but it didn't, it went up. So again, we were confused. We didn't know what to do with this, but we published it anyway. So each time we do these experiments, we are actually we like to see things that we didn't predict, because it tells us a clue that something about the way we're asking the question is not completely right. Next up is electrical plasma. So this uses one of these little balls you can buy. It's 8 inches wide. In the US, costs around $40. We have a webcam looking at it, and that's the target. So we have the same designs as before, concentrate and rest. There's a slightly different idea here in that here's the ball inside our shielded chamber. We close the door, take all of the information out with fiber optics, so it's properly shielded. Outside of the chamber, the person has an effigy ball. So the effigy ball is exactly like the one inside, except we don't turn it on. We say, the computer will say, now aim high, which means imagine that the streamers in this plasma are going up. And so you touch the ball. If you actually touch the ball, all the streamers would go up because you would change the capacitance. But here you're using the effigy ball to get the task out of your head. Because these are so abstract. So we said, okay, touch the ball and imagine that in the process of doing that, you're pulling the streamers up, and that will be as though you were pressing the ball over here. So it's sort of modeling the idea of that you would see in a voodoo doll, that you're touching this, but it's actually doing something elsewhere. So that's aiming up, and this is aiming to the side. And so again, we'd hope that you'd see more light going to the side. So I'm going to skip over a lot of details here and just show you this is what the camera sees. We use 2 different kinds of balls. This is the kind of data you get from it. From the ball, and you have to detrend it, and here's concentrate and relax and concentrate and relax and so on. So when people are asked to aim right, these are statistically significant pixels, or actually they're not voxels. It's sort of like a voxel, but it's an area, a small area of what the camera is seeing, which is comparing against the baseline, and it was significantly brighter. So aiming right, you get this sort of shift to the upper right. This is aiming right. It does shift to the right, mostly up. And then this aiming up, it mostly shifts to the left. Well, we don't know why it did that, but there's quite a significant difference between these 2 aims. And by the way, the protocols always are randomizing what you're getting. So we're not going to fall into some kind of trap where there's a sequence going on or something. It's always randomized. And so if you look at the effect sizes, this is both balls, one plasma ball, the other plasma ball, to just show that the type of plasma ball didn't really make much difference. And again, 30 participants, each time looking at a control immediately before or immediately after each session. So we're trying to keep it as the controls as close to the experiment as possible. So again, we found something interesting. Other kinds of experiments. Global consciousness. So here we're looking at the matter is a quantum random number generator. Mind is collective coherent attention. The meaning is assigned by the investigators who select events of worldwide interest. So here's our triad. So the detectors, our random number generator produces zeros and ones. If you look at it over a long period of time, it's very, very close to what you'd expect by chance. You can use that to measure entropy, and an easy way of doing that is looking at the distribution of samples over time. And essentially, we're looking at how this bell-shaped curve rings over time in relationship to what is happening in the world. So here's our version. This ran from 1998 to, it's actually still running, but the formal experiment ended in 2015. Each random generator sends its data. This is the prime mover of this project, Roger Nelson, who I was my colleague at Princeton. So the data is sent up to from every generator around the world. There were about 50 on average. It actually peaked at around 70, but today there's still about 20 that are running. And the design is important. The events worldwide are selected before the data are examined. We're getting data pouring in continually. The method of analysis that we use to look at the data is predefined. The entire database is publicly accessible and is still true today. You can download all 110 gigabytes if you like. So here's an example of the kind of event that we figured as experimenters, we should look at seeing what's happening, since this would attract an enormous amount of attention. So this was 9/11. That's when the planes crashed. And as you can see, what is a random walk beforehand, definitely not a random walk afterwards. It took a couple weeks for this to die down. And then you can do things like pull the same amount of data randomly from the rest of the database, run the same analysis, and you get nothing as compared to the actual data itself. So there's something very strange happened in the data at that time. And this is based not just on generators that are in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere, or the Pentagon and so on. These are generators from around the world. So this is an average of around the world. Another example, when Nelson Mandela died, and this was part of his funeral, or his death was, I guess, there, and then the news started to circulate. Here's the 0.05 probability envelope, and it looks like a lot of people paying attention coherently to the same thing produces something like order appearing in the world. And again, we can do things like, this was that we had 368 events so far, and we did a large-scale simulation with both true random data and algorithmic random data, and it always is well behaved. It goes inside the probability envelopes, but not the actual data. So we finished this with 500 events in 2015. This is now a 7 sigma result. So there's no possibility of this being a chance outcome. And the question could arise, well, what about all the other days? Well, because, I mean, we only looked at 500 days over a period of 17 years. So what about Chinese New Year's? Did we look at that? And what about other things going on? So I addressed that issue in the paper I published that came out in January, looking at every single day and looking for changes from a random walk based on methods like multi-scale entropy and other forms of decomposition of the data. And you can see then that the data, even though each random generator is well tested, each of the days actually have unexpected structure in them, suggestive of this global consciousness effect. You may be interested to know that we are now pretty close to launching what we call GCP 2.0. It'll have 4,000 random generators. We call them quantum noise generators because we're recording the noise itself rather than turning into bits. The reason we're doing that is because we want to be able to reverse engineer why we're getting these effects. If you have a commercial random number generator that's only producing bits, you can't figure it out because for reasons that are too difficult to explain right now. But with this method, with these 4,000 quantum noise generators, we have the possibility of seeing what is happening at the quantum scale that is actually producing this effect. All right, now quickly some other things. What if you'd use intention to bless food with the intention of changing people's mood who eats the food? Well, we did a double-blind randomized placebo-controlled experiment. We asked a Buddhist monk and a Mongolian shaman to mentally bless, using whatever method they wanted to, these little pastilles of dark chocolate, and we had controlled chocolate from the same source elsewhere. We recruited people to either get, under blinded conditions, blessed chocolate or controlled chocolate. They were asked to record their mood every day of the week at night using a validated mood reporting scale. They were asked to eat the chocolate Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. only. And what we found was what we hoped to see, which was mood disturbance, which is like a double negative. Mood disturbance went down, meaning they had better mood when they're having the blessed chocolate as compared to the controlled chocolate. And on the third day of eating the chocolate. When you do a clinical trial, it's very hard to recruit people. This was the easiest experiment ever to recruit people because we said you had to eat this special gourmet brand of chocolate. So we had to beat people with sticks to make them go away because they kept volunteering. What about tea? Well, there's the tea ceremony, which is all about intention. And so I have a colleague in Taiwan, and we decided, okay, let's use tea. We're in a big batch of oolong tea, separated into two batches, one the control, the other one was blessed by 3 Buddhist monks at a temple in Taiwan. We recruited 100 people in each case. We put the tea in little bottles. Again, double-blind randomized placebo control. This case, we're using a measure called change in mood, significant positive change in mood for people getting the blessed tea as compared to the control. What about plant growth? So what we've done now is moving from a subjective sense, mood, into objective sense, like does the plant actually grow more if you use exactly the same thing we did before? So we're using Arabidopsis thaliana, a very well understood plant, same Buddhist monks, the same Buddhist temple. We have control water, we have blessed water from the same location. And so we grow the seeds with the 2 types of water. Here's my colleague, Yongyong Xia in Taiwan. This is double blind because the person who is handling the water and growing the seeds did not know which was which. He just knew there was A and B. And all the measurements are also blinded. They knew A and B, but they didn't know what that it was. So we're interested in something called the hypocotyl, which is what happens when a seed starts growing. It's the top of the roots to the bottom of the first leaves. What you want in a healthy plant is a short, fat hypocotyl. So we did it. We did 9 repeated experiments. This is the overall result. We get a shorter, fatter, I'm not showing the fat part, but a shorter hypocotyl for the treated water, or the blessed water, as compared to the control. So in terms of magnitude, it's not gigantic, but in terms of statistics, there's no question. These are 95% confidence intervals. These hypocotyls were different. What about stem cells? Stem cells are highly reactive. They pluripotent. They can change into anything. So we figured maybe they're sensitive to intention. So we had the Buddhist monks again create control and blessed water. We got these machismal stem cells out of dental pulp, put them in culture, and then grew them in water, either with the controlled water or the blessed water. The medium of growth was made with these kinds of water. And so using a repeated measures de novo, you get a significant effect, a significant interaction in the direction of the blessed or the treated water actually showing better results. There are lots of other measures we took on here, including genetic measures and so on, and found lots of changes in the treated condition as compared to the control. So this is no longer in press. This is published a year or 2 ago. What about intentionally influencing brain cells in vitro? So we used a method called Jo-Ray, which is similar to Reiki, a mental healing technique, except instead of a person there was Petri dishes with cells in them, neural cells, brain cells, and a double-blind analysis of the cell cultures. This was the result. So these are the treated cells. These are cells in identical conditions as a control. So the first day of the test, second day of the test, third day of the test, that trend was highly significant. No significant trend in the controls. These arrows are pointing at questionable counts. It was hard to count sometimes how much growth there was in each culture. So we did tests both taking with these in the statistics and without, and you get the same results. It didn't matter. And at the same time, we're running 5 random number generators in the chamber where this Jo-Ray method was being used. So here's the baseline beforehand. Those are the 3 days of the experiment. We saw a common deviation among all 5 generators, up to 5 sigma deviation, that then went back to baseline after the experiment. And we've seen this actually several times now in different kinds of experiments, that random generators stop behaving randomly when there's some kind of a focused, coherent mental state happening. So I've showed you mainly the experiments that I've done. My colleagues as well have done experiments from photons all the way down to human behavior. We see these effects, generally small in magnitude, but statistically quite real, in a huge range of different kinds of things. In a broader sense, there are entanglement-like experiences that transcend space or time, that involve this sort of thing between minds, this sort of thing where somehow your intention is expressed out into the world, and this thing where the world is somehow arriving into your head and even slipped in time. So the classical terms are telepathy and psychokinetics and remote viewing and precognition. So it brings us to the notion of entangled minds. So I see I'm gonna run out of time here. So what I'm gonna do, I'll go quickly through, no, actually I won't. It'll take too long to go through telepathy. So instead, I'm gonna jump all the way over to this end part, because I could go through all of this stuff in great gory detail. But we'll run out of time. So there's our telepathy. Okay, so let's go here. So I could go through data for telepathy, which is extremely strong at this point, lots and lots of independent replications. We've also done this with the feeling of being stared at, similar to the way that Rupert Sheldrake has done, except we do it in the laboratory. Correlations in distant brain activity, which should happen if telepathy is real and you see these effects. Perception transcending spatial distance, perception transcending temporal distance, both of which have huge databases and both are quite real. So hold on, it's not quite so easy as I'm making out, because psychophysical experiments, I'll use that as a euphemism, these are not physics experiments and they're not psychology experiments. It's the space between physics and psychology. So it's looking at the space between this outer world and inner world, between subjective and objective. It requires special sensitivity, not only to the physics side, but especially to the psychological side. So some of the factors that we know modulate this kind of performance, things that are controllable, either because you select people or because you can measure it, belief, motivation, attention, intention, the set and settings, very important. Personality is important. The mood of the person is important. And whether they have talent is important. So we have some control over that. What we do not have any control over is unconscious wants and fears of the investigators and the participants. And that's a very, very important part, because at this point, we're pretty sure that these kinds of effects are bubbling up from the unconscious. One of the reasons that advanced meditators tend to do better in these tests is because through the practice of meditation, they are slowly moving down, metaphorically, into their unconscious. They have more and more, maybe not control, but at least they know what's going on in their unconscious. So these experiments are not so easy to do. You need to pay very close attention to all of these factors. And if you ask a statistician, well, you've looked at the data, then what do you think about it? So Jessica Utz was president of the American Statistical Association in 2016, and as part of her address, her presidential address that year, she said that the scientific data in support of precognition and other related phenomena are quite strong statistically and would be widely accepted if they pertain to something more mundane. Likewise, Edsel Cardini, a professor at Lund University in Sweden, wrote this article in the American Psychologist, which is the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association. The evidence is comparable to that for established phenomena in psychology and other disciplines. These parapsychological phenomena are quite real. And just like Jessica said, this would be considered no big deal, but it is considered a big deal. But why is it controversial? The evidence is there. And the short answer is because of entrenched beliefs about the mind-matter relationship. Empirically, some of those beliefs are demonstrably wrong. So the common criticisms that you would see today, first of all, accusations of fraud. Second, that the phenomena are literally impossible because they violate physical laws, which is an uncritical adoption of the philosophy of reductive materialism. This is why Skeptical Cat is very skeptical about these criticisms. Even Ottman, Spacker, and Rickles, in their book, ignore all the experiments that I just mentioned. They don't talk about any of them. Why? They say they are due to fraud or experimental incompetence or insignificant. And as a result, they say that taking experimental approaches are wrong-headed. This was quite surprising to me, because if you look at the book and you don't know about this yet, you would say these people must completely buy that these kinds of mental entanglements are real because the evidence is there. So why are they saying there's fraud and incompetence? And where is that coming from? Even this dog is confused. Well, I put it in that this is basically skeptics gone crazy. I don't believe we've met. I don't believe you don't believe we met. Most of it in the academic world comes from peer pressure. That this is simply not something that you talk about in the academic world. Your credibility will be ruined, or at least will be questioned, if you say, yeah, I think some of these things we call psychic phenomena are real. So I completely understand why Ottmansbacher and Rickles would not say that in this book, because it would reduce the credibility of the arguments that they're making. Now, I'm speculating. I have no idea why they really did it, but I'm speculating that is the case. And then you find things like this: Annual Review of Psychology, the history is disfigured by numerous cases of fraud, blah, blah, blah. Well, this is conflating fraudulent psychics, which definitely exist, with scientific investigations of these phenomena. So these are the known cases of investigator fraud or misconduct in parapsychology. 1974, a known case of data manipulation. 1978, a suspected case of data manipulation. And 2006, a case of plagiarism. That's it. All of the other things that people talk about are either rumors or not substantiated or have no way of following up if it's true or not. So these are the only known cases. So how that doesn't seem to match this statement. To demonstrate what happens in the academic world, and the fact that most academics are trained in materialism and they don't even know that they're being trained in it. They don't know there are other philosophies of science. So we submitted an article to Frontiers, which is unbiased and fair. And the reviewer said the results are not strong enough to overcome doubts based on the entire enterprise of traditional Western science, and I will do everything in my power to prevent public funding for this kind of research. To which we had to respond, are you serious? This is the editor of a journal that is unbiased and fair, where we're presenting empirical results. So the taboo is very strong. Sean Carroll, the physicist at Caltech, very smart guy. He said, you don't need to set up elaborate double-blind protocols to pass judgment on the abilities of purported psychics, because our knowledge of the laws of physics rules them out. Speculations to the contrary are not the provenance of bold visionaries, but the dreams of crackpots. Well, as I said, Sean is a very smart guy, but he is doing the wrong thing here. You're supposed to pull, not push. An American psychologist, after the article from Edsel Cardinha, who did meta-analyses of 11 different categories of experiments, these psychologists published a rejoinder, Searching for the Impossible. So this is James Alcock, the lead author, and he said, the claims that are made cannot be true. In other words, it's impossible. And as a result, the data have no existential value. That means, as he actually says in this thing, we are not going to talk about the data because it is a priori impossible. Well, I mean, my only response is the way that this lady is looking. Like, are you serious? This was published in a scientific journal. We're not going to pay attention to empirical data because we think it's impossible? Well, yeah, that's what happened. Even Paul Kurtz, the founder of the Scientific Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, these are super skeptics. He said, only a fool of a scientist would dismiss the evidence and reports in front of him and substitute his own beliefs in their place. Okay, Steven Weinberg, Nobel laureate, pretty smart. If there was anything to this, it would be the discovery of the century. It would be more than that. It would overturn all the centuries of work since the birth of modern science. To which I kind of adopt this. What are you talking about? Where's the birth of modern science? So here's where the sun ignites and the earth is formed and blah, blah, blah. The birth of modern science is an extreme infancy. It has just begun to imagine at this point, we understand what mind and matter can do and what's possible and impossible. That is, I consider that kind of a crazy thing. That is so biased that you're not able to see outside of the bias. So I put the monkey up there because I like that monkey. So when I hear that, I'm thinking like this, that dogs are so cute when they try to comprehend quantum mechanics. We are the dogs. We're trying to understand something which is so complex at this point that we actually don't even understand anything. And so to make these statements like these phenomena, of which there is a very strong empirical evidence, are impossible, sorry, but that's just stupid. Okay, time to cool off is my last couple of slides. This is a poem. When I heard the learned scientist, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and the diagrams to add, divide, and measure them. When I sitting heard the scientist where she lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon, unaccountable, I became sick and tired and sick. Till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. Thank you, Walt Whitman. I partially changed his original poem, and I thank you for your kind attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dean, for your wonderful presentation. Thank you very much for this.
You're welcome. I'm sorry it went longer than I thought, but oh well.
That's okay. It was popular request to hear everything. So thank you very much. Jonathan, would you like to come in?
I've got a couple of questions I'd love to ask, but I think more important that everybody else dives in first. Come back to me at the end.
Okay, no problem. We do have 5 minutes. Well, just over 5 minutes. So maybe we can pick out maybe 1 or 2 questions. Let's invite Barnaby in first.
I'll keep it short. You mentioned Bohm's implicate order, and Bohm also had a theory of super implicate and super implicate orders. And I wonder if there's a way you conceptualize what he might have meant by that, or how we might think about it in relation to your work.
What I would do in that case is go to Basil and ask him, because he'd be a lot closer to it than I would.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Barnaby. Next, let's go to Philip.
Hello. Thank you for all this dedicated work. I haven't been part of the previous discussion, so I may have missed discussion of this, but I expect you're aware of the work by Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose and their OR theory. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it would suggest there's a whole other hour I could have talked on. Is there the possibility of quantum phenomena operating in the brain? And if there is, and Stu Kaufman and I wrote a paper on this, if there is such evidence, then you could predict that some aspects of perception, some aspects of observation should actually spread out. It shouldn't just be locked inside there in a classical sense, but there should be parts of it that are elsewhere, because we evolved in this way. And presumably, if you have access to other information, it'd be great value for evolution. So that's another way, another entree into saying, if the brain operates in any quantum fashion at all, of which there's growing evidence, including the OR method of Hameroff and Penrose, then yeah, you can begin to predict that there will be certain ways in which the kinds of phenomena that I'm talking about should exist. And so for 20 years or so, I've been predicting that some graduate student is going to use that as a justification for doing experiments on telepathy or something like that. And they will find it, and they will say, for the first time ever, we've demonstrated that telepathy exists, because nobody knows about the rest of this data.
Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Next, let's bring Saad in.
Thank you very much, Dean. That was enlightening as always from you. So appreciate the time you spent in with this. Quick question for you with regards to actually measuring the state of the brainwave activity with observers. Have you gotten to the point where we can actually see whether they are in alpha state versus delta state versus gamma state, and whether that has a distinct influence? I think that'd be very profoundly interesting.
Yeah, well, I spoke about the study that we did with the single photon double slit system, where we had 32 channels of EEG. And we were able to show that at least when alpha desynchronized, showing that there was a shift in intention, they did better. And it didn't always happen every time. Sometimes people were partially asleep when they were told to concentrate, and their brain showed no shift. So we've done that, and it's at this point fairly easy to look for these kinds of correlations. The problem is that we still don't have a way of telling what exactly did they do mentally, because we don't have we have neuroimaging probes, but it's still not exactly telling you what they did. It just shows shifts of attention and things of that sort. But yeah, there is the correlation's in the direction that you would expect.
But any of the other waves that have been measured as well, whether they're in gamma specifically or delta?
We have that data. We found some evidence that gamma increased. So alpha would decrease, gamma would increase. So we know that, but those are, I mean, the EEG bands are useful, but they're pretty crude too. So we'd much rather use like a high resolution fMRI, but you know, you need money to do that. So we haven't done that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, there's a question in the chat that I'd like to read out, which is, what role does the fundamental nature of spirit in the human essence and also in the entire universe, including matter, play in the understanding of entanglement?
Well, the short answer is I don't know. And it's, as an empiricist, I look for things that I can test. So I need to understand what a spirit would mean. What do I do with it? How do I use that in an experiment to test something? So the question that is asked is essentially one of philosophy, maybe even theology. And I don't know how to test those things. I mean, it's an important question, but again, I don't know what to do in the lab about it.
Are you happy to go a little bit over?
I'm happy, yeah.
Okay, great. I'd like to invite Bernard Carden in.
Dean, thank you so much. You put quite a lot of emphasis on using meditators in your experiments, but there are many different forms of meditation, and they stress different aspects of mind. So can you be a little bit more precise? What sort of meditation are you using?
We took all comers. We took anybody who had any kind of mental attention practice. And it's true, it's not just meditators. People may be a healer who is doing work that is essentially intentional, and even there, a lot of healers say they don't use intention at all. So we tried to select people who were comfortable with the idea of using focused intention on these kinds of experiments. For example, with the Buddhist monks, they didn't have any problem with this at all, because part of their job is to do those kinds of blessings anyway, right? So we didn't ask them, what kind of, are you doing Zen, or what kind of meditation are you doing? We chose them because that's what their job is to a large extent. And the same with the Mongolian shaman. So these are people who do rituals that involve ritualistic ways of using their intention to do something. And in general, they've always done the best in our studies. Like the one with Swami Veda, that one blew us away because we saw such a strong effect that we've personally felt as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. But you might expect different types of meditation to have different levels of success.
Yes. So if you're trained in Vipassana or mindfulness meditation, and it's sort of an open focus thing, you would not be very comfortable then narrowing your focus to do the task. And so again, this is one of the many varieties of experiments that could be done. So one of the reasons I've given so many talks on these things is to try to get other people to take up these questions, because they're all very important questions, and you know, we can only do as much as we can do. So if we had 1,000 people doing this, we'd have much more information about, is there a particular kind of meditation or a particular kind of focus, and even physical target that's important. But at this point, we're scratching the surface.
Well, please carry on scratching, because it's great.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bernard, for coming in. As we should really approaching the end of the session, I would like to invite Jonathan back in. I do apologize for those who do have hands up. However, we can carry on this conversation on Sutra on our online forum, so we can discuss more on these topics in that space. Jonathan?
Yeah, two quick questions, if I may. I'll try to make them quick. Coming back to what Bernard and you were saying about meditation, that was going to be one of my questions. it's clear there's a lot of research going on meditation at the moment. It's crept its way into, shall we say, orthodox psychological research. But I think also I'm right in saying that IONS did a survey some while ago of people who had experienced meditating and whether they reported synchronous experiences, more that sort of thing. And there was obviously a very positive correlation, I think I'm right in saying then. Do you think
Yes.
it's possible that this, shall we say, fringe area might creep into the mainstream through meditation research?
Oh, it is. It already is. And even more so for people doing psychedelic research.
Right, of course.
Because, I mean, I've been contacted by some of the major groups in the United States that are doing psychedelic therapy because they keep bumping into phenomena like, especially like telepathy.
Right.
And or group telepathy. I mean, all kinds of strange things happening. And what they want to know then is the same thing that I want to know. Is this simply a subjective experience, or is it objectively true? Well, the experiments I were talking about are all about objectivity, and the effects look like they're real. I kind of suspect that as we see, the moment that people step out of the ordinary state of awareness is very different, and you're able to do things that you can't do in your ordinary state. So psychedelics blast you into non-ordinary states of awareness where suddenly all of these kinds of phenomena are just front and center.
Yeah, right. And I guess my other question then is a slightly more personal one, if I may. We often hear, we hear talks from scientists a lot, obviously, you know, and the sciences that we hear about are all theory-led, or at least theory intense. You know, you're in an area where there is no particular theory. You know, there are ideas, there are thoughts, you presented some of your own thoughts. But what's it like to work in an area which is like sort of theory less?
Well, I'm driven by curiosity, and I'm an empiricist. So I'm intrigued by a story that somebody tells me, and I try to think of a way, how can I show whether that's simply a delusion on that person's part or one of the other psychological biases, or if it's real. So that's my main motivation. When I do an experiment and I get interesting results, or even results which are opposite to what I was thinking about, I just find that thrilling.
Yeah.
Because it's saying there's something about the nature of reality that mystics have been talking about forever, and I'm not a mystic. I mean, I pay attention to the literature, but I don't spend 20 years in a monastery somewhere. But what they talk about as part of the nature of reality is kind of what we're seeing using the tools of science, even with all the constraints that we have in doing these kinds of experiments. So it makes me pay a lot more attention then to the mystical literature and also the esoteric literature and those traditions that are providing what is mostly metaphorical ways of describing whatever a mystic is experiencing. Well, so like anyone else who is not interested in the ultimate nature of reality.
Yeah.
I think that's, so if I think of why am I here? Why am I doing this? Well, part of a long tradition of people who want to know what is reality like. And I didn't take the mystical path, I took the scientific path, but the end goal is about the same.
And you're heading in the same direction anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jonathan, for coming in. As we are approaching the end, I'd just like to come back to you, Dean, to see if you have any words to finish this session.
I had a lot more I could have said. And as I said earlier, at the very beginning, that I've never given this particular talk before, and I didn't know how far I could get. But now I kind of understand that to actually unpack this, both from an empirical perspective and also from psi perception, I haven't talked about telepathy and clairvoyance and all that. I could have done the same thing with those kinds of phenomena. It would take probably 8 hours, 10 hours, something like that, to kind of survey what we know. Then it becomes even more interesting when you start diving into the details, because the details are just as interesting in terms of how did you get that result? What do you think that means? All those kinds of things. So someday I'll do that, or maybe I'll have to write another book.
Absolutely, yeah. So I can see from the chat that people do want to hear more. So Maybe we need to
You want the book?
do a sequel to this session at some point together. Thank you so much, Dean, for your presentation, and we do really want to hear more. And thank you, Jonathan, of course, for bringing everything together, and to everyone here who contributed through your messages in the chat and your contributions with your questions. Before we go, I'd just like to invite you all to tomorrow's session, which will be the final session of this series, which will be led by Dr. Vandana Shiva, talking about living in a non-local world, entanglement meets ecology. And also would like to invite you to our event next Wednesday, which is a free event led by Rupert Sheldrake, which will be on the science delusion, to sort of a reflection of a banned TED Talk that was given by Rupert Sheldrake. So I hope to see you all then. Otherwise, you can always get in touch with us. You can email eleanor@partycenter.com. That's the best way to reach us. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow. Have a good day, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.